In an upscale coffee in the heart of the city, the warm, golden lights created a cozy yet elegant atmosphere. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the soft murmur of conversations and the occasional clinking of porcelain cups. Couples sat at small tables, engaged in romantic exchanges, completely immersed in their own worlds. Emily stepped inside, her heels clicking lightly against the polished floor. She sighed inwardly, feeling both frustrated and reluctant. She had absolutely no interest in blind dates, but her best friend Sophia had begged her to take her place. Sophia's family had set up the date, but since she already had a boyfriend, she had no choice but to send Emily in her stead to sabotage it. All I need to do is make unreasonable demands and scare him off. Easy, Emily thought, flipping her hair over one shoulder. She had been told to sit at table 6, but without paying much attention, she mistakenly sat down at table 9. Across from her sat a man with an air of quiet dominance. His sharp, chiseled features and tall frame made him impossible to ignore. He wore a tailored black suit, perfectly fitted to his broad shoulders, exuding an air of power and confidence. His deep, penetrating eyes studied her with an unreadable expression, making Emily momentarily pause. For a split second, she hesitated. He didn't look like the type of man who would need to be set up on a blind date. But she quickly shook off her thoughts. She wasn't here to make a good impression. Leaning back in her chair, Emily crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. I'm not one for small talk, so let's get straight to the point. If you want to marry me, I have 3 conditions. The man remained silent, his expression unreadable, his fingers lightly tapping against the table as if amused by her boldness. First, I need a $500,000 dowry, immediately. A few nearby patrons overheard her and turned their heads in shock. Emily smirked internally, enjoying the drama. Second, you have to buy a house and a car for me, and for my little brother. The air grew heavier as her words hung between them. But Emily wasn't done yet. And third, she paused slightly for effect, I will never love you. This will be a marriage on paper only, and you are not allowed to interfere with my life. She sat back, fully expecting him to be appalled. No sane man would accept these ridiculous terms. He would walk out, and her job here would be done. But what happened next was completely unexpected. The man across from her showed no signs of irritation or shock. Instead, he calmly reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a sleek black credit card, and placed it on the table. Emily blinked. The money in this card is your deposit, he said, his voice deep and steady. I'll transfer the remaining amount in 3 days. Emily's breath hitched. This wasn't going as planned. Before she could fully process what was happening, he continued, but I also have one condition. There was something in his gaze, intense, unwavering, that made her heart skip a beat. We get married immediately. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. Are you serious? She stammered. I don't joke. His tone was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. For the first time in the entire conversation, Emily felt truly caught off guard. She had expected him to walk away, not to agree so effortlessly. But then, an image flashed through her mind. Her mother, lying weakly on a hospital bed, in desperate need of an expensive surgery, her chest tightened. She had no other choice. Emily inhaled sharply and forced herself to meet his gaze. If I say yes, you'll transfer the full amount in 3 days? The man nodded. I keep my word. A dangerous game was unfolding before her eyes, but she had already stepped into it. She took a deep breath and made her decision. Fine. I agree. A faint smirk appeared on his lips. Good, he said. We'll go to the marriage bureau tomorrow. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had just agreed to a contract marriage with a total stranger, and she had no idea that this man was far more than he appeared to be. The next morning, Emily found herself standing in front of a sleek black car, her suitcase in hand. The realization hit her. She was really about to move in with a man she barely knew. After signing the marriage certificate, Alexander had arranged for a driver to pick her up and take her to their new home. As the car pulled up in front of a modest apartment complex, Emily blinked in confusion. "This is where we're living?" she asked, turning to Alexander with wide eyes. With his wealth, she had expected a luxurious penthouse or a mansion, not an ordinary apartment. It wasn't shabby by any means, but it was far from the opulence she had imagined. Alexander didn't even glance at her. "We don't need anything flashy," he replied, stepping out of the car. Emily narrowed her eyes. Something didn't feel right. A man who could casually hand over a black card with $500,000 should not be living in such a simple place. "You're telling me that a man who can throw around that much money prefers to live here?" she pressed. Alexander paused briefly before turning to her, his expression unreadable. "I like my privacy." Emily wasn't convinced, but she didn't push further. She followed him inside, suitcase rolling behind her. The apartment was neat and well organized, but minimalistic. There was no trace of any personal belongings, no family photos, no signs of a previous resident. It felt more like a temporary living space rather than a home. "Do you live alone?" she asked. "I do now." His vague answer only made her more suspicious, but she decided to let it go, for now. "There are a few house rules," Alexander continued as he set his briefcase down. "First, don't bother me when I'm working. Second, don't touch my personal belongings. And third, when my grandmother visits, you need to act like a proper wife." Emily raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "So basically, I'm not your wife. I'm just a tenant with extra responsibilities." Alexander glanced at her, his lips twitching slightly as if amused by her sarcasm. "Call it whatever you want," he replied. She let out a small huff. This was going to be interesting. The next morning, Emily got up early, preparing for her first day at work. When she stepped out of her room, she found Alexander already dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, adjusting his cufflinks. "You're leaving for work, too?" she asked. "Yeah." "What do you do?" He briefly paused before responding. "I'm a secretary." Emily nearly choked on her coffee. "A secretary?" she repeated incredulously. "You're telling me that a man who handed me a black card worth a fortune is just a secretary?" Alexander remained calm, slipping on his watch. Surprised? Emily frowned, watching him carefully. Something didn't add up, but she shrugged it off. "Well, I suppose it's none of my business," she muttered, grabbing her bag. What she didn't know was that Alexander was lying. He wasn't just a secretary. He was the CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the city. At work, Emily quickly noticed strange things about him. Employees acted overly respectful toward Alexander, even though he claimed to be just a secretary. Whenever there was a major issue, all eyes turned to him for a decision, instead of the so-called CEO. She once overheard a group of executives whispering in the hallway, "The president already made his decision." Since Alexander approved it, we don't need to discuss further. Emily's brows furrowed. President? Alexander? Something was definitely off. That night, as Emily scrolled through her phone on the couch, she glanced toward Alexander's study. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she saw him sitting at his desk, staring at an old photograph in his hand. His expression was different, not the usual calm and composed look he always carried. Instead, his gaze was soft, almost melancholic. Inside that photograph, A young boy and girl stood under a large tree. The boy held the girl's hand protectively. The golden hues of the setting sun cast a warm glow over them. A memory surfaced in Alexander's mind. Years ago, when he was just a child, there was a girl who followed him everywhere, who clung to him like a shadow, who made him promise something under that very same tree. "When we grow up, will you marry me?" the little girl had asked, her bright eyes filled with innocence. Alexander had chuckled at the time, ruffling her hair. "Of course," he had said. "I promise." But fate was cruel. His family had moved away suddenly, separating them before he could even say goodbye. No matter how much he searched, he could never find her again. Back in the present, Alexander tightened his grip on the photo. Could it be? He glanced toward the living room where Emily sat, unaware of his thoughts. From the moment he saw her, he felt a strange familiarity, as if he had met her before, somewhere, sometime. But was it possible? Could she be that girl? But before he could think further, Emily's voice cut through the silence. "Hey, what are you doing?" Alexander swiftly placed the photograph back into his drawer and turned toward her, his expression once again unreadable. "Nothing important." Emily tilted her head, sensing something was off, but not prying further. "By the way, we're meeting your grandmother tomorrow," Alexander announced abruptly. Emily's stomach dropped. "What? Why so soon? She's eager to meet her granddaughter-in-law." Her pulse quickened, pretending to be a loving wife in front of his grandmother. This was going to be harder than she thought. Little did she know, this meeting would change everything. For years, Olivia Lancaster had beauty, intelligence, status. Alexander Kingston. She had pursued him for years, attending the same elite gatherings, finding excuses to run into him, and even moving into a high-end apartment just a block away from him. Yet, no matter how much she tried, he never once looked at her with affection. And now, she had just received the most shocking news of her life. Alexander Kingston was married, to a woman she had never even heard of. Her manicured nails dug into the leather of her car's steering wheel as she stared at the marriage announcement on her phone. Emily Carter? Who the hell was she? Rage burned in her chest. She refused to accept this. That same evening, Olivia stormed into Alexander's office without an appointment. The receptionist, wide-eyed, barely had time to stop her before she flung open the door to his private workspace. Alexander barely glanced up from his documents. "You have 5 seconds before I call security," he said in a low, uninterested tone. Olivia slammed the door behind her, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "What the hell is this, Alexander?" she demanded, holding up her phone with the marriage announcement displayed on the screen. Alexander finally looked at her, but there was no warmth in his gaze. "It's exactly what it looks like. I'm married." "To who?" she spat. "Some nobody? A woman I've never even seen at any social event? Are you out of your mind?" Alexander's eyes darkened. "Watch your words, Olivia." His tone was calm, but ice-cold. "Emily is my wife. That's all you need to know." Olivia's lips trembled with frustration. "It should have been me," she whispered, voice raw with emotion. "All these years, Alexander, I waited for you. I stayed by your side. How could you marry someone like her?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Simple. I never had any interest in you." The words cut deeper than Olivia had expected. She clenched her fists. If she couldn't have him, then neither could Emily. Determined not to lose, Olivia hatched a plan. Since Alexander refused to acknowledge her feelings, she would make Emily suffer instead. A few days later, Emily walked into work only to find an unexpected announcement. "Everyone, please welcome our new department manager, Miss Olivia Lancaster." Emily's blood ran cold. She watched as Olivia strutted into the room, looking every bit the powerful, high-class woman she was. Their eyes met, and Olivia's lips curled into a sickly, sweet smile. "Emily, right?" Olivia's voice dripped with condescension. "I've heard so much about you." Emily forced a polite smile, despite the unease curling in her stomach. She had a bad feeling about this. And she was right. From that day forward, Olivia made her work life miserable. Important emails mysteriously went missing from Emily's inbox. Deadlines were suddenly moved up without notice, leaving her scrambling to complete projects. Whenever Emily tried to present her work, Olivia cut her off and belittled her ideas in front of everyone. But Emily was not weak. She gritted her teeth and endured. She worked twice as hard, refusing to let Olivia see her falter. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that Olivia had something even worse planned. And she was right. Because Olivia wasn't just targeting her career. She was planning to destroy Emily's marriage, too. Olivia wasn't just satisfied with making Emily's job difficult. She wanted to break her completely. After weeks of subtle sabotage at work, Olivia realized something frustrating. Emily wasn't giving up. No mere resilience a capability. That only fueled Olivia's determination. If she couldn't make Emily quit, then she would do the next best thing: destroy her marriage. She knew Alexander well enough to understand his greatest weakness, his loyalty. So, she set a trap. One evening, after another long workday, Emily was finishing up in her office when she received a text message from an unknown number. Anonymous. "Your husband isn't as loyal as you think. If you want proof, come to the Royal Hotel, room 702. Emily's hands tightened around her phone. Her heart pounded as doubt crept in. She trusted Alexander. But a small voice in her head whispered, "Do you really know him?" Unable to ignore it, she rushed to the hotel. When she reached room 702, she took a deep breath before pushing open the door. Inside, she saw Olivia sitting on the bed, draped in a silk robe, a smug smirk on her lips. Emily's stomach twisted. "What the hell is this?" she demanded. Before Olivia could respond, the bathroom door opened, and Alexander stepped out, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, hair still damp as if he had just showered. Emily felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Emily?" Alexander's brows furrowed in confusion. Olivia let out a fake gasp. "Oh no, darling, you weren't supposed to see this," she said, eyes twinkling with mischief. Emily took a step back, her mind spinning. What is going on? What does it look like?" Olivia smirked. "Alexander and I were just reminiscing about old times." Emily's chest tightened painfully. Alexander's expression darkened instantly. He turned to Olivia, his voice sharp and cold. "Enough, Olivia. Stop this nonsense." But Olivia wasn't done yet. She reached forward and grabbed Alexander's wrist, pressing her body closer to his. "Why are you acting so cold, Alex? You didn't seem to mind earlier." Emily felt sick. She trusted Alexander. She wanted to believe in him. But seeing this scene in front of her, it hurt. "You told me this marriage didn't mean anything," Olivia continued, her voice dripping with poison. "So why are you pretending now?" Emily's heart dropped. She turned to Alexander, searching for an answer. "Is that true?" Her voice was barely a whisper. For the first time since she met him, Alexander looked truly panicked. "Emily, listen to me." But she didn't wait for him to finish. Emily spun around and walked out. She didn't stop. Not when Alexander called her name. Not when her vision blurred with unshed tears. Because at that moment, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Alexander shoved Olivia aside and stormed after Emily. "You really think this will make me love you?" he snapped at Olivia, his voice filled with cold fury. Olivia simply smiled, pleased with herself. You're finally paying attention to me, aren't you? Alexander clenched his jaw, his patience gone. Stay out of my life, Olivia. With that, he left the room, his only focus on finding Emily. Meanwhile, Emily walked aimlessly through the streets, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The scene had felt staged, too perfect, too convenient. And then, she remembered. Alexander hated hotels. He never stayed in them, not even for business trips. Realization hit her like a thunderbolt. I've been played, and there was only one way to find out the truth. The next day, Emily returned to the office. She walked straight into Olivia's department and slammed a file onto her desk. You set me up, she stated, voice calm but deadly. Olivia blinked, feigning innocence. I don't know what you're talking about. Emily leaned closer, her eyes burning with determination. I found out that you were the one who booked that hotel room. You sent me that text. You planted everything. Olivia's smirk faltered just slightly. So what if I did? She finally admitted, crossing her arms. You're just a nobody, Emily. You don't belong by his side. Emily didn't flinch. Neither do you. A slow smirk spread across Emily's face as she pulled out her phone and pressed play. A recording played. Olivia's voice. You're finally paying attention to me, aren't you? Alexander's voice. Stay out of my life, Olivia. Olivia's face drained of color. Where did you get that? Emily tilted her head. Let's just say you're not the only one who knows how to set a trap. Olivia's hands curled into fists, but she knew she had lost. Because the next moment, Alexander walked in. His gaze landed on Emily first. Soft, relieved. Then he turned to Olivia, and his eyes turned to ice. Pack your things, he said flatly. What? Olivia stammered. You're fired. Emily watched as Olivia's world crumbled, and for the first time since this war had started, Emily had won. Ever since Olivia's departure, things had changed between Emily and Alexander. There was less tension, fewer walls between. Emily noticed small things. How subtly take care of her, how he would wait for her to finish work so they could go home together, how he always seemed to know when she was having a bad day, and would leave her a cup of coffee just the way she liked it. On the other hand, Alexander found himself drawn to Emily in ways he never expected. She wasn't just his contract wife anymore. She was the first person who challenged him. The first person who looked him in the eye and didn't treat him like a god. The first person who stood by his side even when she had every reason to walk away. And that realization terrified him, because feelings were never part of the plan. One evening, Emily was working late at the office. She was going through some financial reports when she came across an internal document, one that listed Alexander Kingston as the majority shareholder and CEO of the company. She froze. Her hands trembled as she reread the document. Number that. That can't be right. Her mind raced back to all the strange moments she had ignored. The way the board of directors always looked at Alexander for final decisions. The way employees treated him with unspoken authority, even though they believed he was just a secretary. The way he seemed to know everything about the company, more than any mere assistant should. Emily felt her stomach drop. Alexander had lied to her for months. When Emily got home that night, Alexander was sitting in the living room, reading a document. He looked up and immediately noticed her expression, her eyes filled with hurt and anger. What's wrong? He asked, setting his papers down. Emily threw the file onto the table. You tell me, she said, crossing her arms. Alexander glanced at the document. His face didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. Emily scoffed. So it's true. You've been lying to me this entire time. Alexander let out a slow breath. I never lied, he said evenly. I just didn't tell you." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "That's the same thing, Alexander." Her voice shook. "I trusted you," she whispered. "I defended you. And this entire time you've been keeping this huge secret from me. What was I to you? A joke?" Alexander stood up, his face darkening. "You were never a joke." Emily's chest tightened. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Alexander hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "Because I didn't want you to see me the way everyone else does." Emily swallowed hard. "And how is that?" "As someone untouchable." His voice was quiet but heavy. "As someone people either fear or worship. I didn't want that with you." Emily felt her anger waver. She could see the honesty in his eyes, but it didn't erase the hurt. She turned away, rubbing her temples. I need time." Alexander nodded. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept replaying everything in her head. His words, his actions, her feelings, and somehow she found herself standing outside Alexander's study. She knocked hesitantly. The door opened almost immediately. Alexander stood there, looking at her as if he had been waiting. Neither of them spoke. But something shifted in the air between them. The next moment, Emily reached for him, and he pulled her into his arms. Their lips met, hot and desperate, like they had both been holding back for too long. That night, everything changed. Because for the first time, their contract didn't matter. For the first time, this wasn't about an agreement or a deal. It was real. In the soft glow of the morning light, Alexander's gaze traced Emily's bare shoulder as she slept beside him. His fingers absent-mindedly brushed over a faint birthmark on her skin. And then his entire body went still. His breath hitched, because he recognized that mark. It was the same one from his childhood memory, the same little girl he had once promised to marry. It was her. Emily was the girl he had been searching for all these years. His Emily, his chest tightened with emotion. He had thought he lost her forever. But fate had brought her back to him. A few months later, Emily and Alexander took a trip back to the countryside, to the very place where their story began. Under the shade of the same old oak tree, Alexander suddenly took a deep breath and got down on one knee. Emily's heart stopped. "Emily," he said, looking up at her with eyes full of devotion. "Marry me, for real this time. No contracts, no conditions, just us, forever." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she laughed through her emotions. "You already promised me once when we were kids," she teased. Alexander smirked. "Then I guess I'm just keeping my word." She laughed again, nodding before he even finished. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, pulling her into his arms as the wind rustled through the trees. The little boy and little girl who had once promised to marry each other had finally found their way back. And this time, they would never be apart again. Years later, on a quiet afternoon, Emily sat on a park bench, watching a little girl with Alexander's eyes run across the grass, laughing. A gentle hand touched hers. She turned, smiling as Alexander leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked softly. He chuckled, pulling her close. "I always knew," he whispered against her hair. And as she watched their daughter chase butterflies, her heart overflowed with happiness. Because after everything, after years of separation, misunderstandings, and unexpected fate, they had found their way back to each other. And this time, it was forever. Emily spent days trying to process everything. The memories that had once been buried slowly resurfaced. The sound of laughter under a big oak tree, the warmth of a little boy's hand in hers, the promise made so innocently, yet never forgotten. She had tried to deny it, tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, she knew the truth. Alexander was the boy from her past, and now he was the man she had unknowingly fallen in love with. One evening, she stood on the balcony of their apartment, looking out at the city lights, her mind filled with emotions. Alexander walked up behind her, silent, hesitant. "Emily," he finally said, his voice quiet but filled with undeniable longing. She turned, meeting his gaze, and this time there was no doubt in her eyes. "You were looking for me all this time, weren't you?" she whispered. His jaw tightened, his eyes filled with emotion. "Always." A lump formed in her throat. "I was looking for you too," she admitted, her voice trembling. The moment those words left her lips, Alexander closed the distance between them. His hands framed her face gently, as if he was afraid she would disappear. "Then don't run away from me anymore," he murmured. Emily didn't. She closed her eyes as his lips met hers, soft, warm, and filled with years of unspoken emotions. In that moment, she knew. This was love. Not a contract, not an obligation, just them, together.